There are men in Chicago who never have to raise their voices. Raphael Stanton was one of them. He was 34. He ran the shipping terminals on the south end of Lake Michigan, and the people who owed him money learned quickly that he didn't threaten anybody. He simply remembered. On a wet November night, he came home 3 days early from a merger meeting, and he didn't call ahead because he wanted to surprise his wife. In the trunk of his car sat a gift for her, and a pair of soft gray-blue gloves for his mother's arthritic hands. He let himself in through the basement entrance, still smiling, and then he heard running water. He heard his wife's voice too, but it wasn't the voice he knew. It was flat, and it was cold, and it was giving orders. The laundry room door stood open a few inches. What Raphael saw through that gap was a 71-year-old woman sitting on a low plastic stool, both hands in a basin of water so cold the pipes had gone damp. Her fingers were shaking, his mother's fingers, and 4 steps away, holding a glass of lemon water, his wife was explaining in the gentlest voice imaginable why this was good for her. Raphael stood in that dark hallway for 9 minutes without making a sound. Then he did the one thing nobody who knew him would ever have predicted. He turned around, walked back to where his car was waiting, and got in. If you're new here, take a second to hit that like button, share this with somebody who'd want to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now let's follow him as he drove away. Because what this man did over the 11 days that followed is the part nobody saw coming. The car left the private road leading to the main gate, its tires grinding over the wet gravel, and Raphael never once turned back to look at the house. November rain swept across the windshield in waves, while the wipers moved with the steady rhythm of someone breathing carefully, trying to remain calm. He sat in the back seat with his spine straight and both hands resting on his thighs. The thumb of his right hand slowly turned the plain silver ring on the ring finger of his left. The ring had belonged to his father, a mechanic who had died before Raphael was old enough to drive, and Raphael only turned it when something in his mind needed to be taken apart and arranged again from the beginning. The driver, a man named Emmett, had worked for him for many years, long enough to know when to ask questions and when to remain silent. Tonight, he asked nothing. He simply kept his eyes on the road ahead and maintained an even speed. The city lights spread across the rain-soaked glass, breaking into long streaks of gold before fading away. The phone inside Raphael's coat pocket began to vibrate. He looked at the name on the screen, let it ring 2 more times, and only then answered. On the other end was Dutch Halverson, the manager of Pier 9, a man who had worked there since Raphael's father was still alive. Dutch's voice carried the hesitation of someone who knew he was calling at an hour when he shouldn't. He said there was a problem involving the Pruitt contractor. Someone on the weighing crew had spoken up. For 2 years, the cargo weight slips had been recorded below their actual amounts, and everyone could guess where the difference had been going. Raphael listened to the end without interrupting him once. When Dutch finished, Raphael asked only 3 questions. Who had approved and signed those weight slips? Who else knew about it? And whether Pruitt had a family? Dutch answered the last question by saying the man had a child attending college in Champaign, a senior who was about to take the final graduation exams. A long silence followed over the line. Emmett glanced into the rearview mirror and saw Raphael's face in the darkness. He couldn't read anything there, and he immediately looked away. Raphael spoke in an ordinary voice, the same voice he used when asking whether it was going to rain that day. Let the child finish this semester first. Wait until the graduation is over. After that, revoke Pruitt's access permit to the pier, terminate every contract that's still in effect, and send copies of every weight slip to the Port Authority through the proper procedures, without leaving out a single page. Dutch asked whether Raphael wanted someone to speak privately with Pruitt first. Raphael said no. No one was to go near him. No one was to call him. No one was to wait outside the parking lot. And no one was to do anything except file the paperwork. Then he added one more sentence, and Emmett heard every word clearly in the silence of the car. I don't need anyone to suffer. I need the entire pier to remember what happens when someone thinks I'm not counting. Dutch said he understood. The call ended. Raphael placed the phone on the seat beside him and looked out through the window. He thought about the word counting, and about how he had spent so many years counting everything. He counted cargo weight, counted the hours when ships came into port, counted every dollar of discrepancy hidden inside contracts as thick as dictionaries. He could sit in a meeting room and remember the exact number someone had spoken 3 years earlier, then repeat it in a voice gentle enough to send a chill through everyone in the room. He had counted everything in the world except the nights his mother had spent alone in the house he'd built for her. The thought came quietly, like a tiny thorn buried in the palm that a person only discovers when the hand closes by accident. He clenched both hands, then slowly opened them again. The car crossed the bridge, and the lake below was black and solid, with the rain striking its surface without making a sound that could be heard from that height. Emmett cleared his throat and asked whether Raphael was going home. Raphael looked into the rearview mirror, and this time he didn't look away. "Take me to the Drake Hotel," he said. Emmett nodded without asking anything else. He simply turned on the signal and made a turn at the next intersection, heading in the opposite direction from the brightly lit house behind them. In the trunk, the gift for Raphael's wife remained inside its box, unopened. Beside it lay a pair of soft gray gloves, the ones he had spent a long time choosing in an airport shop, asking the saleswoman which pair would allow a hand aching with arthritis to keep holding a needle. He had imagined his mother unwrapping the paper and smiling. He hadn't imagined the scene he had just witnessed in the basement, and now he knew he would never forget it, because he was a man who only knew how to remember. Not far away, on the south side of the city, a young woman stepped out through the hospital doors before dawn had fully broken. Delphine Halloran was 26 years old, with auburn hair hastily tied back by a stretched-out elastic band, and beneath her eyes were dark circles that no inexpensive foundation could conceal. On her feet were sneakers whose soles had been patched with glue, a pale yellow seam running along the edge of the rubber, and she knew that spot would come loose again when the rain grew heavier. Her younger brother, August, was 19 and had just finished his dialysis treatment. The pre-dawn session was the least expensive, and they had chosen it long ago, long enough that neither of them needed to discuss it anymore. Before leaving, she had pulled the blanket all the way up to his shoulders, and he had opened his eyes and told her in that familiar hoarse voice not to look at him that way because he was still plenty handsome. She had laughed, and the sound of that laughter followed her all the way to the bus stop. She waited beneath the shelter, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold the night before, while inside her coat pocket rested a brown notebook with worn corners. Delphine worked as an hourly home health nurse. People paid her by the shift, with no insurance and no benefits, and her schedule was broken into pieces scattered across the city. Mornings in one place, afternoons somewhere else, then office cleaning at night to make up whatever was still missing. But 3 mornings each week, she went to the large house on the north side, the one surrounded by a tall iron fence and a yard so vast it took time just to cross it. She had been going there for more than a year, and the strangest thing about that place wasn't the size of the house, but the fact that whenever the gate made its familiar clicking sound, a 71-year-old woman inside would place one hand on the arm of her chair, push herself upright, and walk to the door on her own to greet Delphine. She didn't do that for anyone else. Not for delivery workers, not for the gardeners, not for the expensively dressed visitors who stopped by from time to time. Margaret Stanton was small, with silver hair gathered into a low bun and a back that bent slightly forward after 30 years spent standing beside an industrial pressing machine in a laundry factory on Halsted Street. That morning, she was already seated in the small rear kitchen, and when Delphine came in, Margaret told her she had boiled the water. Delphine told her to stay seated, then washed her hands, took a bottle of massage oil from her bag, and pulled a chair close. She lifted the older woman's right hand and rested it in her own palm. The finger joints were swollen, the skin as thin as tissue paper, and an old steam burn on the wrist had faded after many years. Delphine massaged slowly, beginning at the wrist and moving upward, working each finger a little at a time, never rushing. Margaret closed her eyes and breathed out. As Delphine worked, she told a story about the laundry factory. She spoke of one summer when the ventilation system had broken and the entire building had become as hot as an oven, and of a coworker named Ruthie, who had secretly brought in a small battery-powered fan hidden inside her work coat. Delphine had heard the story 3 times before. She knew exactly where Margaret would pause to laugh, and the older woman stopped at that very place, just as she had the previous 2 times, laughing so softly that her shoulders trembled. Delphine laughed with her and didn't say that she had heard it before. She stood and warmed the chamomile tea, exactly the kind Margaret liked, placed the cup in her hands, and waited until she was holding it securely before letting go. When everything was finished, Delphine sat down, opened the brown notebook, and wrote a few lines in her small handwriting. Margaret watched her and asked what she was writing in there. Delphine only said she was writing things down so she wouldn't forget, then closed the notebook and slipped it back into her coat pocket. Beyond the window, the night rain had stopped, and the first light of morning lay dimly across the wet yard. Those 2 hours passed very quickly. When Delphine began gathering her things, Margaret was still holding the cup of tea. She was no longer drinking it, only cradling it to keep her hands warm. Then she asked a question in a voice so quiet that Delphine had to lean closer to hear. She asked whether Delphine had seen her son call home. Delphine stood motionless in the middle of the kitchen, the cleaning cloth still in her hand, and she didn't know how she was supposed to answer. Around the same time, on the north side of the city, in a room on one of the upper floors of the Drake Hotel, Raphael Stanton sat on the edge of the bed and looked down at the pair of gloves placed before him. He had brought them up from the trunk, along with the paper bag whose folds were still crisp, then set them on the white bedspread and sat down. He hadn't touched them once since. The gloves were gray-blue, made of soft wool, with the fingertips left open, the kind designed especially for hands that could no longer bend and straighten as they once had. He had stood in the airport shop for a long time choosing them. The saleswoman had shown him 3 kinds, and he had asked which pair would keep the wrists warm while still allowing someone to hold a needle. She had assumed he was buying them for his wife. He hadn't corrected her. Now the gloves lay there beneath the yellow light of a rented room, less than half an hour's drive from his own house. Raphael raised a hand and pinched the bridge of his nose. There was no screaming inside his head, no anger rising into flame. There were only old images coming forward on their own, one after another, like someone turning through photographs kept inside a tin box that hadn't been opened in years. He remembered the small third-floor apartment in Bridgeport, and the smell of starch and steam that clung to his mother's hair whenever she came home. She stood beside the pressing machine for 12 hours a day, sometimes longer, and when she walked through the door, both her hands were red, as though she had dipped them into boiling water. He remembered asking whether they hurt. She always gave him the same answer, saying she wasn't tired, saying the factory hadn't been busy that day. She repeated those words so often that the boy he had been believed them, and only now did the man he had become understand that some lies, when told long enough, take root inside the heart of the person who hears them. He remembered an evening when she sat at the kitchen table, turning her bare ring finger back and forth, then told him she had lost her wedding ring at the factory, that it had probably fallen into a pile of dirty laundry and been carried away somewhere. She had said it lightly. She had even laughed and told him the ring had grown too tight anyway. He had believed her. He had believed her from that day until now, and had never once asked again. Raphael took out his phone, opened the message thread with his mother, and scrolled upward. He went back through autumn, through summer, even through the winter before. And what chilled him wasn't what the messages contained, but the fact that every one of them was exactly the same. Keep working. I'm fine. Don't worry about me. The house is very quiet. I just woke up. Remember to take care of yourself. Hundreds of lines like those stretched across 2 years, without a single complaint, without one question that required him to answer with more than 2 words. He had once believed they were proof that everything was all right. Now he sat there and understood that a person only wrote that way after deciding long ago that they would never become a burden to anyone. He kept scrolling and stopped at a video she had sent the month before. He pressed play. In the frame, his mother sat in her room, holding the phone a little too low so that her chin was clearly visible. And she smiled as she said she was only sending him something to look at, that it was nothing important. He watched it again. Then again. On the 3rd viewing, his eyes left her face and drifted toward the table behind her. There was a bowl sitting on it, a beige plastic bowl, the kind sold in bulk at inexpensive houseware stores. Everyone in his house used the set of white china with gray trim that he himself had ordered years earlier, and he had never seen a plastic bowl in his kitchen. Raphael stared at that tiny object in the corner of the frame, and something inside his chest began to tighten very slowly. He scrolled down to the bottom, where his own response appeared. He had watched the video for only a few seconds between 2 meetings, then sent a red heart and moved on to the next message. He remained sitting like that for a very long time, the phone in his hand, the unopened gloves lying on the bed beside him. That plastic bowl wasn't the only thing that had changed in the house, and there was someone who had seen far more than that 3 weeks earlier. That afternoon, Delphine went down to the basement to look for clean towels, because the cabinet in the older woman's room had been empty since the day before, and no one had restocked it. She took the back staircase, and when she was still a few steps from the bottom, she heard water. It wasn't the sound of a washing machine. It was water running into a basin, followed by fabric rubbing against fabric, a sound she had known since she was a little girl in her own home. She walked to the laundry room door and stopped. Margaret was sitting on a low plastic stool in front of a galvanized basin on the floor, her sleeves rolled high, both hands submerged in the water. She was scrubbing a white shirt, slowly, little by little, and her shoulders curved forward, as though the full weight of the task had settled onto her back. Delphine reached down and touched the rim of the basin. The water was bitterly cold. She asked what Margaret was doing, and the older woman looked up and smiled as though she had been caught doing something clumsy, then said they had given her these shirts, and these were special order pieces that couldn't be washed in a machine. Delphine didn't ask another question. She walked to the corner of the room, opened the cover of the water heater, saw that the indicator light was completely dark, then turned on the hot water tap at the nearby sink and held her hand beneath it. The water was still cold. She stood there for several seconds with her jaw clenched, then turned, took a pair of rubber gloves from her work bag, the kind she always carried with her, and handed them to the older woman. She told Margaret to put them on, then sit still and let her do it. Margaret said this wasn't part of Delphine's job, and told her not to. Delphine had already knelt beside the basin and lowered her hands into the water. She said she would decide what counted as her work, and Margaret needed to sit somewhere warm. It was at that moment that the sound of heels crossed the tile behind them. Sienna stood in the doorway, her honey blonde hair arranged in neat waves, a phone in one hand, and she didn't raise her voice once. She only smiled. The kind of smile people give a child who has made a small mistake. She said she appreciated Delphine's enthusiasm. She truly did. But Delphine's responsibilities were limited to mobility assistance and medication monitoring, and they didn't include household chores. She said the family had its own methods, all for medical reasons, and that her mother-in-law needed to exercise her joints every day because the doctor had recommended it. She added that when outsiders interfered, everything became more difficult to manage. Then she looked down at the rubber gloves in the older woman's hands, kept her smile perfectly in place, and said she would call the agency to discuss the assignment. Delphine stood up, water dripping from her hands onto the floor. She looked at Margaret. The older woman had lowered her head, still holding the gloves she hadn't yet put on, and she didn't look up. 2 hours later, while Delphine was riding the bus home, a supervisor from Meadowlight called. The person sounded embarrassed, and said the client had complained that Delphine had exceeded the limits of her duties and made the family uncomfortable, that all her shifts at that address had been canceled, and that the matter would be entered into her personnel file for future reference. Delphine asked what exactly would be entered. The supervisor replied that it would simply say there had been a client complaint, nothing serious. Delphine ended the call and stared out the window for the rest of the ride. But she didn't stay silent. 2 days later, after a night shift, she sat at her kitchen table, opened a laptop borrowed from the public library, and submitted a report to the state's Elder Protection Hotline. She gave the full address, stated clearly that the water heater had been broken since summer, and described how the older woman was being made to perform tasks her physical condition didn't allow. She signed her real name. She knew she could have filed anonymously, but she believed no one would take it seriously if she did, so she signed her real name. A week later, 2 people came to the house. Sienna answered the door, wearing a cream-colored sweater, invited them into the living room, and poured coffee. A printed binder was already waiting on the table, labeled care log, listing medication times, meals, exercise periods, everything arranged neatly by day. The house was spotless. That day, Margaret was served a proper lunch on the white china with gray trim, and she was invited to sit with them. The 2 visitors asked her several questions. They didn't speak loudly. Their voices were polite, and they sat across the width of the table from her. Margaret heard perhaps half the words. She looked at their faces, then at Sienna sitting beside her with a smile, and she nodded and said everything was fine. The case was closed not long afterward, with the conclusion that there wasn't sufficient evidence to intervene. In the file, on the line identifying the person who had made the report, Delphine Halloran's full name was written out. That name lay forgotten inside a closed case file, and no one in the house thought of it again until 4 o'clock the following morning, when Hollis Brennan's phone began vibrating on her bedside table. She answered after the second ring because she had worked for this man long enough to know that he didn't call at that hour to make conversation. Hollis was 58 years old, with short ash-colored hair, and she had spent 2 decades working as an investigator for an insurance company before Raphael invited her to oversee security for his entire logistics network. She was the only person in the organization who dared interrupt him in the middle of a sentence, and that was also why he kept her. She sat up in the darkness, reached for the notebook and pen she always kept nearby, and told him she was listening. Raphael didn't offer a long explanation. He only said he needed every system in the house inspected, and he needed to know what happened in the common areas when he wasn't there. He spoke in his usual voice, the same one he used when discussing shipping schedules. Hollis was silent for a moment. Then she asked him a question no one else would have dared ask. She asked whether he wanted her to find evidence or find the truth, because the two weren't always the same. On the other end of the line, Raphael looked out through the hotel window at a city that was still dark. He said he wanted whichever one no one could dispute. Hollis wrote a line in her notebook and asked nothing more. She didn't ask why. She only asked whether he wanted it done cleanly or quickly. And when he said cleanly, she told him to give her until noon. The difficulty wasn't the equipment. The difficulty was getting people into a house while the lady of the house was present without letting her see that anything unusual was happening. Hollis sat at her computer all morning, reviewing every system log from the property, and she found what she needed in the basement. The alarm system down there was old, installed when the house had first been built, and its gas sensors had been giving false readings since summer. She triggered a self-testing cycle, and just as she had calculated, by afternoon the control panel in the kitchen began emitting intermittent beeps, while a line of red text warned of abnormal gas levels in the basement area. Sienna was the first to see it. She stood in front of the panel with a frown, then immediately called the property's technical maintenance department. She didn't call because she was worried about anyone. She called because the house would be receiving guests the following week, and she couldn't allow some strange odor rising from below ground to ruin the evening. She told the dispatcher she needed a team to inspect the entire system, not only the basement, to check everything and check it thoroughly, and she wanted it completed before the weekend. The following morning, 3 people wearing protective work clothes arrived. Sienna herself opened the door for them. She led them through the hallway, showed them where the electrical panel was, warned them not to scratch the walls, then gave each of them a bottle of water and returned to her guest list. Over the next 3 hours, they replaced the old sensors, inspected the pipes, and installed additional devices no larger than a fingertip in the ceiling corners of the hallways, the kitchen, the laundry room, and the open space between the living room and the staircase. No one in the house noticed. Sienna signed the completion report in her elegant slanting handwriting, thanked them for coming so quickly, and escorted them all the way to the gate. That afternoon, Raphael called home. He said the partners had requested another assessment of several items, so he would have to remain away for 2 more weeks. Sienna sighed, told him she missed him, and said the house was far too large with no one there. She told him she was preparing a dinner to celebrate his return, that she had ordered flowers and contacted the chef, and she asked which region's wine he preferred. He gave her a vague answer. Then he asked one more question, without changing his tone, as though it had only just occurred to him. He asked how his mother's hands had been lately. There was a silence on the other end of the line. It was very brief, shorter than a single breath, so brief that 3 weeks earlier he wouldn't have noticed it. Then Sienna's voice returned, warm and perfectly rounded, saying his mother was much the same, that the colder weather had made the pain a little worse, but she was still reminding her to exercise regularly. Raphael said yes, thank you, then ended the call. He sat for a very long time with the phone in his hand. He had listened to thousands of negotiations throughout his life, and he knew well that the most expensive thing in any conversation was never the words that were spoken, but the silence immediately before them. He sat in the darkness for a long time after that call, and within the half-beat of silence he had just heard, something else rose to the surface, something he hadn't allowed himself to think about for many years. His father had been a mechanic at the harbor. His name was Augustin, a quiet man who had a habit of wiping his hands on his trouser legs before touching his son. One spring morning, a crane at Pier 4 malfunctioned, and his father never came home. The company issued its conclusion within a week, neat, complete, and properly stamped, stating that the accident had been caused by the operator's failure to follow procedure. That conclusion allowed them to avoid paying a single dollar in compensation. Margaret sued them. She rode the bus to the courthouse wearing the finest clothes she owned and carrying a stack of documents she couldn't fully understand. She lost. Not long afterward, the laundry factory on Halsted Street dismissed her, giving as its reason a carefully worded sentence about her having a negative effect on the general working environment. Raphael was 16 years old then. He left school that autumn and went to the very harbor that had taken his father to ask for work loading cargo. Many years later, he bought the company. He used nothing but patience. He tracked their bad debts, acquired the company one piece at a time, waded through 2 recessions, And only on the day the papers were signed did they discover that the man sitting across from them was the son of the name recorded in an old accident file they themselves had approved. The thin scar running along his left eyebrow came from another night, one that had happened even earlier. That night, a man came knocking at the door of the third-floor apartment in Bridgeport to collect a debt Raphael's father had borrowed before he died. The man refused to remain outside. Raphael could only remember his mother taking one step backward and himself stepping forward to stand between them. He never told anyone what happened during the rest of that night. He didn't tell his wife, didn't tell his friends, and didn't tell anyone even during those late evenings when alcohol made other people speak more freely than usual. The only thing anyone knew was that the man later moved to another state, and the debt was never mentioned again. Once, during a tense meeting, a business partner slammed his hand on the table and demanded to know why Raphael never lost his temper, why he simply sat there like a statue, as though nothing could touch him. Raphael waited until the man had finished speaking. Then he replied that he had lost his temper exactly once, when he was 16, and he hadn't liked the person he became that night, so he had decided never to become that person again. The entire room fell silent. No one asked another question. From that night onward, he built his whole life around a single principle. He didn't threaten, he didn't raise his voice. He simply remembered, and he allowed the records to speak for him. It worked so well that it became the very thing that made people fear him more than any threat ever could. But sitting in that hotel room that night, with the unopened gloves lying on the bed and his wife's voice still lingering in his ears, Raphael realized something he had never understood throughout all those years. He had built a perfect system to make certain no one could ever reach him. And while raising that wall, he had unknowingly left his mother on the other side of it. The wall began to reveal itself clearly the following evening, when Hollis sent him the first link. Raphael turned off the lights in the room, pulled his chair closer to the desk, and opened the screen. He had prepared himself for arguments. He hadn't prepared himself for the silence. The recording from the kitchen ceiling began before dawn. In the dim gray frame, the door to the room at the back opened, and his mother came in, one hand resting lightly against the edge of a cabinet, her feet in thick socks, making no sound. She turned on the small light above the stove instead of the ceiling light. She opened the refrigerator. The light from inside fell across her face and illuminated everything within it. Fresh vegetables arranged in rows, a tray of meat still sealed beneath its wrapping, yogurt, fruit, all of it plentiful. She didn't take any of those things. She reached into the middle shelf, removed a plastic container holding what was left of the previous night's meal, closed the refrigerator, then heated it in the microwave, and ate alone at the kitchen counter while it was still dark outside. Raphael rewound the moment when she opened the refrigerator, froze the frame, and enlarged it. A small paper label had been attached to the glass shelf in the middle, printed in neat letters, stating that this food was reserved specifically for her and politely requesting that she not take more than the allotted amount so her portions could be monitored. He stared at those words for a long time. They were polite. They were orderly. They had been written in the kind of language no committee could ever officially call wrong. The next recording came from the first-floor hallway. In the afternoon, 3 women arrived as guests, and the sound of their laughter carried out from the living room. Margaret came from the direction of the staircase, stopped several steps from the living room door, and went no farther. She simply stood there. One hand rested against the wall, and she remained in that position while the people inside talked about their travels and newly opened restaurants. The clock in the corner of the recording continued to move. She was still standing there. Then she turned around and went back up the stairs, more slowly than she had come down. No one in the living room ever knew she had been outside. The third audio recording came from the upstairs hallway that evening, as Sienna paced back and forth with her phone held between her shoulder and her ear. Her voice was relaxed, with laughter woven through it, the voice of someone speaking to a close friend. She said old people needed structure. They really did. Because if you didn't give them something to do, they would find a way to occupy space in your home until there was nowhere left that felt like your own. She said she wasn't cruel. She was simply someone with clear boundaries. And that was something most women in her position didn't have the courage to do. Laughter sounded from the other end of the call. She laughed with it, then moved on to discussing the flowers for the party. Raphael stopped the recording, rewound it, listened to that part a second time, then muted the sound and sat motionless. The final recording from that night came from the kitchen near dusk. Margaret was carrying a stack of plates from the table to the sink. She had made it halfway when the top plate slipped and shattered across the tile into several pieces. Sienna entered from the hallway. She looked down at the floor, then told Margaret to leave it there and said she would call someone to clean it up. The older woman had already begun to bend down. Sienna watched for another moment, then changed her mind. She said Margaret might as well pick it up, because otherwise she would have to explain it to the staff and they would start asking questions. Then she turned away, lifting her phone to look at it as she walked out. Margaret knelt beside the broken pieces. She picked them up one by one, slowly, gathering them into her left palm and placing them on a sheet of newspaper she had spread across the floor. When she had collected the final piece, she remained on her knees for a while longer, looking down at the tile to make certain nothing had been missed. Then she raised her head and looked toward the doorway where her daughter-in-law had disappeared, even though there was no one left in the room, and she apologized. Raphael closed the computer. The following morning, Hollis called him before he had the chance to call her, and that alone was a sign. She said she had spent the entire night reviewing a small detail she had almost dismissed at first, then asked whether he remembered the phone his wife had bought for his mother at the beginning of the year. Raphael remembered. It was a model designed for older people, with a thick body, large buttons, oversized text on the screen, and a red emergency button on the back. Sienna had brought it out during dinner, wrapped in glossy paper, and explained that Margaret often pressed the wrong things on her old touchscreen phone, so this one would be much easier for her to use. Margaret had held it in both hands and thanked her. Raphael remembered thinking at the time how thoughtful his wife was. Hollis said she had checked the contacts stored in the phone. There were exactly 3 numbers. One belonged to Sienna, one connected to emergency services, and one was saved under the name Raphael. She paused for a moment before continuing, saying she had called that number from another phone. It wasn't his cell phone number. It was the main forwarding line for his office, the number every outside call was routed through, the number no one in the family had used to reach him in all the years that had passed. Raphael said nothing. Hollis went on, explaining that she had asked the technical department to export the call records for that line and filter them by his mother's number, beginning on the day the new phone had been activated. She said she was sending the file to him. Then she added one more sentence, and her voice changed, becoming lower and slower. The voice of someone who had spent a lifetime reading too many case files and still hadn't learned how to become numb to them. She told him to sit down before opening it. Raphael opened the file. It was a simple table with only a few columns, black letters on a white background. Nothing frightening in the way it looked. 7 entries. The first was from an afternoon near the end of winter. The second came 3 weeks later, close to midnight. The third was from an early morning, so early that he knew the sun hadn't risen yet, and he remembered that his mother still woke at that hour. Then there was another at the beginning of summer, one on a day when he knew with certainty that he had been sitting on an airplane. One late on the evening of his birthday, after the party had ended, and the final one, less than a month earlier, on a rainy afternoon. Beside each entry was the duration of the call. Not one lasted longer than a few seconds, only long enough for someone to press the number, lift the phone to her ear, hear the ringing give way to a polite recorded voice announcing that she had reached the company switchboard, and asking her to leave a message after the tone, then lower the phone again. 7 times. 7 times she pressed the number. 7 times she heard a voice that wasn't her son's. 7 times she ended the call without leaving a message, because in her mind, leaving a message at her son's company office was the same as disturbing him at work, and she had spent her entire life trying not to trouble anyone. Raphael sat before the screen and couldn't say a single word. Through all those months, he had believed his mother didn't call because she needed nothing. He had believed her silence was proof of peace. He had told himself that she would call if anything was wrong, that she knew how to call, that she had a new phone after all, and throughout that entire time, she had been calling. She had never stopped trying. She had only been calling a door that had been locked from the inside, and the person who locked it had smiled, wrapped it in glossy paper, and handed it to her as a gift. While reviewing the system, Hollis found something else, smaller but more persistent: the gate access log. For more than a year, one name had appeared regularly 3 mornings each week, always in the morning, always staying for exactly 2 hours. Then 3 weeks earlier, that name disappeared from the list and never returned. It took Hollis less than half a day to discover that the woman was now working the night shift in an office building in the Loop. At 2 o'clock the following morning, Raphael stepped out of the elevator on the 14th floor. The hallway was empty, with only the sound of a vacuum cleaner drifting from the far end, and the smell of artificial lemon floor cleaner hanging in the air. Delphine was pushing a supply cart, her hair tied back and her sleeves rolled high. She looked up and recognized him immediately, even though she had never spoken to him once during all the time she had worked in his house. She straightened, one hand still gripping the mop handle, and he could clearly see her calculating the distance to the emergency exit. She spoke before he had the chance to say a word. She told him she had been warned that he was someone she should avoid. Then she added, her voice hoarse but steady, that she had spent more than a year inside his house, and she knew who the person worth avoiding truly was. Raphael didn't argue. He didn't tell her who he was, didn't mention what he already had in his possession, and didn't make any promises. He asked only one question, whether she had reported it to anyone. Delphine watched him for another moment, then let go of the mop handle and sat down on the plastic chair against the wall. She told him about the report she had submitted to the state hotline, about signing her real name because she was afraid no one would take it seriously if she remained anonymous, about the two people who had come to the house and sat in the living room with cups of coffee, about the neatly prepared binder already waiting on the table, and about the final conclusion stating that there wasn't enough evidence to intervene. She said she had waited for weeks afterward, thinking every day that surely someone would call her back that day. No one did. Then she fell silent for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. She said she knew everything. She had known for a long time. But every time she tried to open her mouth and tell someone more, she saw her younger brother's face as he lay connected to the dialysis machine, and she swallowed the words. She said losing a job didn't simply mean losing a job. Losing a job meant that the following month, her brother would miss a treatment. Raphael stood there without sitting down, both hands motionless at his sides. He asked what she wrote in the notebook. Delphine looked up, surprised that he knew there was a notebook. Then she said slowly that her mother had died in an inexpensive care facility in the suburbs, while Delphine was still in school and could only visit on weekends. After her mother died, she requested a copy of the records. They contained the date of admission, the date of death, and a few lines about medication. There was nothing else. No one had written anything down. No one had recorded what she liked, what stories she often told, when she laughed, or whether she had said anything during her final weeks. Delphine said an entire human life had passed without leaving behind even one line. So now she wrote things down. She wrote everything, because if no one remembered them, then someone had to. Then she reached into the pocket of the coat hanging from her supply cart, took out the brown notebook with its worn corners, and held it out to him. She didn't tell him to take it, and she didn't tell him to read it. She simply extended it toward him, and withdrew her hand once he was holding it. Raphael didn't open it there. He thanked her, asked what time her shift ended, and asked nothing else. Throughout the drive back, he sat in the rear seat with the notebook resting on his lap, both hands holding it, without leaning back or looking through the window. Emmett glanced into the rearview mirror once, and saw that man holding an old-school notebook the way someone carries something that might shatter if placed in the wrong spot. The following morning, Raphael said nothing about the notebook. Instead, he did something else, the thing he had always done best. He told his assistant to pull up the list of tenants in buildings owned by the corporation, and he found the name Meadowlight Home Care somewhere past the 10th line, leasing 3 office floors on the west side, with its contract approaching renewal. He didn't call anyone and make threats. He simply requested a meeting, and during that meeting he asked the director exactly one question about the company's complaint handling procedure. Specifically, what procedure had led to a nurse losing every one of her shifts because she had turned on hot water for a 71-year-old woman. He said he was asking because he liked to understand the people to whom he rented property. No one raised their voice. The meeting ended in less than half an hour. That afternoon, the note in Delphine Halloran's personnel file was removed, and her supervisor called her with a warmth she had never heard before, saying there had been a misunderstanding, that the company was deeply sorry, and that she could return the following week with a better schedule than the one she had before. Delphine listened to everything. Then she thanked the supervisor and said no. That evening, she met Raphael again at the diner beneath the building where she worked, because he wanted to tell her that her record had been cleared. She pushed her coffee cup aside and said she knew who had done it, and she thanked him sincerely. Then she said she wouldn't return to a place that had taught her that turning on hot water was beyond the limits of her job. Raphael looked at her for a moment, then nodded. He didn't try to persuade her with another word. He also didn't mention the debt he had learned about, the figure buried inside the stack of bills she kept in a drawer and no longer opened. It remained there untouched, exactly as it was. That same week, he scheduled a complete medical examination for his mother with Dr. Priya Ramanathan, a geriatric specialist recommended by Hollis, under the pretense of a routine early winter checkup. The doctor called him back 3 days later. She said she was going to speak plainly, and she hoped he would listen to everything before reacting. His mother had lost a significant amount of weight since her previous examination and showed signs of mild malnutrition. The skin on both hands was inflamed from prolonged exposure to cleaning chemicals. But what concerned the doctor most wasn't any of that. Since spring, the medical record had contained an order for a repeat hearing test because Margaret's hearing loss was progressing. That order had never been carried out. No one had taken her. Raphael asked what his mother had said during the appointment. The doctor was silent for a moment, then replied that Margaret had answered every question with the same 2 words, "I'm fine." She said she had asked about sleep, meals, pain, and whether anyone at home was helping her, and all 4 times Margaret had said she was fine. Then the doctor added that she had worked in this field long enough to know that when an elderly person said, "I'm fine" 4 times in a row, it was no longer an answer. It was a door quietly closing. That afternoon, Hollis sent him a photograph. While checking the sensors again on the 2nd floor, a technician had needed to pull the cabinet in Margaret's room away from the wall, and beneath it, behind a stack of old towels, there was a paper package. Inside was the cream-colored wool scarf Raphael had sent home from a trip the previous spring, with the price tag still attached, never opened and never worn. Tucked into one of its folds was a small piece of paper, covered in trembling handwriting, the letters slanting in the way people write when their hand can no longer hold a pen steadily. On it, his mother had written herself a reminder not to wear the scarf in front of Sienna because she said it made her look as though she were asking for pity. Raphael looked at the photograph inside the car. He didn't cry. He simply sat in silence, and Emmett didn't dare start the engine for 20 full minutes. While reviewing the email system to find out whether anyone else had ever tried to tell him something, Hollis found a message sent in the spring of the previous year. The sender was Odessa Wheeler, the housekeeper who had worked in that home for many years before leaving in the middle of the year. The subject line was simple: a small matter concerning Mrs. Margaret's health. The message had reached the company inbox. It had never reached Raphael's. It had been redirected into an archive folder labeled Personal Matters, a folder he had never opened once in his life, and the filter that created it had been set up through his personal assistant's account. Raphael called Marisol Avendaño into his office that morning. She was 41 years old, had worked for him for 6 years, and remembered his schedule more accurately than he did himself. She entered the room, sat down, and when he placed a printed copy of the email on the desk, she didn't turn pale and didn't rush to defend herself. She looked at the page, read the subject line again, then said, "Yes, I remember this one." Raphael asked why. Marisol opened the bag at her side, took out an old hardbound work notebook, turned back several dozen pages, then stopped at one line and rotated the notebook toward him. She said she had written down every instruction he had given from her very first day. On that line was the date of some Tuesday morning, and beside it was a sentence recorded word for word in small, precise handwriting. "Don't send me anything about household matters during working hours. My wife can handle it." Raphael stared at the sentence. He remembered that morning. He remembered preparing to walk into a meeting about a harbor contract, his phone ringing without pause, and someone from the house calling to ask about replacing the living room curtains. He had been irritated. He had said those words while walking into the hallway, without thinking, without considering them in order, only a tired man's thoughtless remark. Marisol had written it down because that was her job, because when you worked for a man like him, the way to survive was to record everything he said and carry it out exactly. She continued in the same calm voice, saying that from that day onward, she had created a filter, so messages related to the family wouldn't appear in his main inbox, and every month she checked the folder to make certain nothing urgent had been missed. She said Odessa's email hadn't contained the word urgent, hadn't included a phone number requesting a return call, and had only said there was a small matter concerning Margaret's health. She said she had forwarded it to the Household Personnel Department, according to procedure, and that department had passed it on to the lady of the house. Then she fell silent. Raphael sat there for a long time. He had been searching for a betrayer. He had prepared anger inside himself, along with a name and a face upon which to place it. But there was no one. No one had betrayed him. No one had taken anyone's money. There was only a man who had ordered the world not to trouble him with household matters, and the world had obeyed him perfectly, faithfully, without missing a single word, for many months. He had built that wall with his own hands. The first brick had been a careless sentence spoken in a hallway, and every day afterward, the people most loyal to him had added another layer, because they believed that was what he wanted. Marisol waited. She asked whether he wanted her to clear out her desk. Raphael shook his head. He straightened in his chair, and when he spoke, his voice was hoarse in a way she had never heard during the 6 years she had worked for him. He told her to write down a new instruction. From that day forward, anything concerning his mother, even a single line, no matter who sent it, and no matter what hour it arrived, was to be forwarded directly to him, not through personnel, not through anyone, regardless of where he was, whom he was meeting, or which time zone he was in. Marisol opened her notebook, wrote it down, then read it aloud to make certain she had recorded it correctly. Raphael nodded, and he realized those words should have been spoken many years before. He had thought he had reached the bottom of it, that everything remaining was only cleanup. Then Hollis called again, and this time her voice didn't carry its usual weariness. There was caution in it, the caution of someone who had just turned over a stone and found something underneath that wasn't what she had expected. She said she needed to meet him in person and wouldn't discuss it over the phone. They met in a small office on the ground floor of the building. The door closed, and she placed 2 things in front of him. The first was a record of the calls and messages sent from Sienna's phone during the previous 3 months. In it, appearing 3 separate times, was a number Raphael recognized the instant he saw it. Conrad Vale's number. Vale had once sat beside him on the Port Authority board many years earlier. The man who had lost a major cargo handling contract to Raphael, after a vote everyone knew Raphael had arranged in advance. Vale left the board afterward, and from that day forward, there had been a silence between the 2 men that both of them understood wasn't finished. The second thing Hollis placed on the table was a printout from a computer. It wasn't a handwritten notebook. It was a spreadsheet, the columns evenly divided, with the title Care Log at the top. And at first glance it looked exactly like the printed binder Sienna had shown the 2 state investigators in the living room. But Hollis had scrolled over to the hidden columns on the right, the ones that hadn't been printed when the records were presented to outsiders. Those columns didn't list medication times. They recorded every night Raphael was away from home, the exact departure and return dates of every business trip, the appointments he missed, even the holidays when he wasn't present. The final column had a heading Sienna had named with chilling simplicity: Evidence of Absence. Raphael stared at the spreadsheet, and for a moment he didn't understand. He asked Hollis why someone who had gone to such lengths to torment her mother-in-law would also sit down and keep such meticulous records about her husband. Hollis sat across from him and spoke in the slow voice of someone forced to say something difficult. She told him he had misunderstood the entire situation from the beginning. He thought Sienna hated his mother. She didn't. She needed her. Then Hollis explained. Many years earlier, to protect his assets from investigations that might target his business operations, Raphael had established a substantial trust in Margaret's name. Under the prenuptial agreement Sienna herself had signed before the wedding, she had no right to touch that trust under any circumstances in a divorce. But there was another door. If Margaret were declared legally incapable of making her own decisions, and if someone were appointed by the court as her legal guardian, that person would gain control over everything held in Margaret's name, including the trust. Hollis continued, and this was the part that sent a chill down Raphael's spine. To obtain that guardianship, Sienna didn't need his mother to disappear. She needed the opposite. She needed Margaret alive. She needed her weak. She needed her dependent, confused, frightened, and unable to speak clearly in front of strangers. A healthy, clear-minded older woman who knew how to defend herself would have no legal value to such a plan. The woman who sat before the 2 state investigators, nodding and saying everything was fine. The woman who waited outside the living room because she had been told to wait. The woman who had learned to apologize in an empty room. That was the woman the plan required. Sienna didn't want her silent out of irritation. She was building a record, night by night, so that when the day came, Margaret would already be in exactly the condition the court was prepared to believe. Raphael remained motionless for a long time. Before he stood, Hollis added one more sentence. Her voice soft, as though it were only a minor detail. She said a registered envelope had arrived at the house the previous week, the kind that required a signature upon delivery. She had reviewed the courier company's delivery log. The person who signed for it wasn't Margaret. Raphael asked who it was. Hollis looked at him for a moment and said she wasn't certain yet, but she believed he needed to know that such an envelope had arrived, and no one in the house had mentioned it at all. On the 11th day, Raphael returned home through the front door. The car stopped before the stone steps, the lights inside the house glowing brightly through the tall windows, and he walked up carrying his suitcase like a man coming home from a long trip, nothing more and nothing less. Sienna hurried out from the foyer in an ivory gown, her hair falling in soft waves, and embraced him in front of 2 attendants carrying flowers. She told him how much she had missed him, and said the house finally felt alive again. Raphael placed one hand against her back. He didn't push her away, but there wasn't the slightest warmth in the gesture. He had learned to keep his face unreadable during the most difficult negotiations of his life, but never before had doing so demanded so much from him. His eyes left his wife and went immediately to the foot of the staircase. His mother was standing there, slightly withdrawn to one side, wearing the gray sweater he knew was the finest one she owned. Her hair had been brushed neatly back and fastened with a small clip. She had made an effort. She had prepared herself for that evening as people prepare for an important occasion, and that was what tightened his throat. He set down the suitcase and walked straight across the foyer, looking at no one else, until he stood before her. Then he did something that made the attendants nearby stop what they were doing. He lowered himself, bringing his face level with hers, because he knew she now needed to see the other person's lips to hear a complete sentence. He took the paper package containing the gloves from his coat pocket, opened it, and slipped them onto her hands, one finger at a time, slowly and carefully, as though the crowded room had emptied, and only the 2 of them remained. She wasn't delighted. It wasn't the reaction he had imagined through all those months. Her hand stiffened inside his, and instead of looking down at the gloves, her eyes flicked quickly toward Sienna, who stood several steps away. The glance lasted only an instant, but Raphael caught it, and it confirmed the final thing he had still doubted. His mother was afraid. She received a gift from her son, and the first thing she did was check whether someone else was watching. He kept his face calm, gave her hand a gentle squeeze, then rose just as the first guests began to enter. The evening started, and Sienna managed it perfectly. She moved among the groups of guests like a fish through water, remembering every name, asking after exactly the right things, and laughing precisely when laughter was expected. She spoke of London, of her husband's business deal, and of the difficulty of managing such a large house alone while he was away. At one point, she passed Margaret, who was seated in an armchair near the fireplace, placed one hand on her shoulder, and told the guest beside her that she was always telling Mother not to do anything, and simply to rest, but Mother refused to sit still because she always wanted to help. The guest laughed and told Sienna how fortunate she was. Margaret looked at the smiling faces around her and smiled with them, the smile of someone who couldn't hear the whole conversation but knew that when everyone else laughed, she was supposed to laugh too. Raphael stood nearby, holding a glass of wine he hadn't touched, and he saw everything. He saw how his wife's hand merely brushed his mother's shoulder without ever closing around it, placed there so others could see, then lifted away the moment no one was looking. He saw how the older woman's smile never reached her eyes. Then the front door opened once more. A young woman stepped inside, wearing a simple dark blue dress and carrying a file bag. It was Delphine. Raphael had asked her to bring Margaret's medical records and test results and hand them directly to Dr. Priya, who was also among the guests that evening, and he had told her she could come straight in, deliver the records, and leave if she wished. She had no idea what she was about to witness. She remained close to the doorway, searching the room for the person who was supposed to receive the file bag, and while she stood uncertainly in a room filled with strangers wearing expensive clothes, her eyes met those of the older woman beside the fireplace. Margaret's face lit up. It was her first genuine reaction of the entire evening, a joy that required no performance, rising naturally as though someone had just opened a window in a suffocating room. Across the foyer, Sienna also saw the woman who had entered, and for exactly half a second, before she could restore the gracious smile of the hostess to her face, her expression froze. As dinner drew to an end and everyone moved into the grand living room with glasses of wine in their hands, Raphael set his own glass on the mantel and rose to his feet. He didn't tap the rim to call for attention, and he didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, and the stillness that came from him caused each group of guests to fall silent one after another and turn toward him, until the entire room had quieted. Sienna stood near the fireplace with her hands folded before her, a patient smile held on her lips, certain that her husband was about to thank her in front of everyone for managing the house while he had been away. Raphael thanked the guests for coming. He said a few words about the journey, about the business agreement he had just completed across the ocean, and about how many contracts a person could sign in a lifetime and still remain unable to purchase the one thing that mattered most. Then the rhythm of his voice changed and became slower. He said that 11 days earlier, he had come home. He said he had returned sooner than expected, without telling anyone, and had entered through the basement door because he wanted to surprise them. Then he said he had stood in the hallway down there for 9 minutes. No one in the room understood what he meant, except one person. The smile was still on Sienna's lips, but it had stopped moving. Raphael looked toward the far end of the room, gave a slight nod, and the large screen above the fireplace came to life. Nothing horrifying appeared upon it. There was no screaming and no violent scene. There was only a laundry room beneath yellow light, an older woman sitting on a low plastic stool before a basin of water, both hands submerged, while a gentle voice from outside the frame explained that this kind of movement was good for mother's joints because the doctor had recommended it. Several guests leaned forward, still uncertain what they were watching. Then the image changed. A refrigerator door opened, revealing shelves filled with fresh food, and on the glass of the middle shelf was a small paper label bearing a polite message about the portion reserved especially for her. The image changed again, this time showing a record from the household management system. 3 requests to repair the water heater submitted since summer, all 3 carrying the same status: cancelled, and beside every cancellation was the name of the account that had performed it, Sienna's account. Then came a food delivery receipt from an ordinary evening at the house, clearly showing the number of meals ordered, only 2. And finally, enlarged across the entire screen, appeared a small piece of paper covered in trembling, unsteady handwriting, a woman's reminder to herself not to wear the scarf in front of Sienna because she said it made her look as though she were asking for pity. The room sank into a silence so heavy it felt like a church after the final candle had gone out. No one raised a glass. No one dared look at the person beside them. One of Sienna's friends lowered her face toward the carpet. Dr. Priya looked toward the older woman beside the fireplace with a sorrow she couldn't conceal. Sienna herself was the one who broke the silence. She straightened, and her voice came out faster than usual and higher than usual. She said everyone was misunderstanding, that the recordings had been taken out of context, and that no one there understood how difficult it was to care for an elderly person. She said her mother-in-law had chosen to do those things, that she refused to sit still, that she liked being useful, and that Sienna was exhausted from carrying the weight of the entire household alone while her husband traveled around the world. Her voice trembled, though not entirely from remorse. Then she raised one hand and pointed toward the far end of the room, where Delphine stood frozen, still holding the file bag against her chest. She asked whether everyone knew who that young woman was. She said Delphine was the person whose company had dismissed her for misconduct, the person who had once filed a complaint against the family and had it rejected by the authorities for lack of evidence. She said Delphine had a motive, that she held a grudge, and that everything happening that evening was nothing more than a performance staged by a dismissed woman conspiring with a husband, searching for an excuse. When she finished, her chest was rising and falling, and her eyes swept around the room, searching for even one face that still believed her. No one answered, and in the center of that silence, Raphael remained perfectly still, never once raising his voice to answer a single word. Raphael didn't answer any of her accusations. He didn't look toward Delphine to defend her, didn't mention motives, and didn't argue about context. He knew that anything he said now could be twisted into another story, and he had learned long ago that some truths didn't need the most powerful person in the room to speak for them. They only needed to be left alone so the weakest person could speak for herself. He turned his back on his wife, on the guests, and on the projection screen that was still glowing, then walked toward his mother, who sat beside the fireplace. Once again, he lowered himself until his face was level with hers, close enough for her to see his lips clearly. He spoke very slowly, separating each word so she wouldn't have to guess. He called her mother. He told her to look at him. Then he said that today, she didn't need to protect anyone, didn't need to preserve anyone's dignity, and didn't need to worry about him. Today, she only needed to tell the truth. Margaret looked into her son's eyes. Her gloved hands rested in her lap, and she held them perfectly still. The entire room waited in silence, and that silence stretched so long that someone had to hold their breath. Her lips moved once, then stopped. She glanced quickly toward Sienna, a reflex that had been driven deep into her over so many months, then turned back to her son, and she spoke. "The water was so cold, son." The entire room broke apart, not with noise, but with something collapsing inside the chest of every person present. One of Sienna's friends raised a hand to cover her mouth. Someone in the corner drew a deep breath. Margaret continued, and this time her voice was a little steadier, as though those first 4 words had loosened a rusted bolt inside her heart. She turned toward the far end of the room, searching for the face of the young woman standing there, and said, "That girl turned on the hot water for me. She said she gave me her gloves and told me to sit still while she did the work. Then she said she lost her job because of it." Delphine stood at the end of the room as the file bag slipped from her hand, and she didn't bend to pick it up. Raphael went fully down on his knees before his mother's chair. He took both of her gloved hands and held them between his palms, then apologized to her. He didn't apologize for being away too long, for the flights, or for the meetings. He apologized for believing that sending money home meant he was present, for thinking that building his mother a large house was the same as being beside her, and for allowing her silence to soothe him into complacency when it should have awakened him. Margaret tried to pull her hands away. She didn't want her son kneeling in a room filled with guests, didn't want him lowering himself in front of those people, and her concern for his dignity was still greater than her own pain. But Raphael held her hands gently and firmly, refusing to let her withdraw them. She looked at him with tears gathering in her eyes, and whispered that she didn't want him to have to choose between his mother and his wife. She said it like a plea, as though even at that moment she was still trying to carry the harder burden herself, so he wouldn't have to suffer. Raphael shook his head very slowly. "Mother," he said, "I'm not choosing anything. I'm not standing between 2 people and deciding which one carries more weight. She was the one who chose, and she made that choice a long time ago, day after day, night after night, while I kept my eyes closed and believed everything was fine." He gave her hands another gentle squeeze. Margaret didn't try to pull them away again. She left them resting inside her son's hands, and for the first time in a very long while, she stopped trying to appear strong, and stopped forcing herself to smile, so other people wouldn't worry. She simply sat there and allowed her child to hold her up, while tears rolled down her cheeks and she made no effort to wipe them away. Behind Raphael, Sienna was still standing in the middle of a room where not a single person turned toward her anymore. He had believed that night was the end of it. For the first time in many days, he managed to sleep for several hours, and he woke with the relief of a man who had finally set down something heavy he had carried for far too long. Then the phone rang, and Tobias Fenn was on the other end, his personal attorney, a man who never called early unless something had happened. Tobias's voice was calm, but it was a calculated calm, the kind people used when they wanted the person listening not to panic. He told Raphael to sit down. Raphael sat down. Tobias said a stack of documents had been delivered to his office that morning, and among them was a petition seeking emergency guardianship over Margaret Stanton. The petition hadn't just been filed, it had been submitted days earlier, during the period when the entire city, including Sienna, believed Raphael was still across the ocean. Tobias said the notice had been sent to the house, according to proper procedure, by registered delivery, requiring a signature in person. Raphael closed his eyes. He remembered what Hollis had said about a registered envelope arriving at the house the previous week, and about the person who signed for it not being his mother. Now he understood what that envelope had contained. Sienna had signed for it. She had accepted it, written her name in the recipient box, and hidden it away. Margaret had never seen the document informing her that someone was seeking the legal authority to decide the course of her life. Raphael remained silent for a long time. He realized that throughout the past 11 days, while he had been carefully assembling flawless evidence to reveal in the middle of a dinner party, his wife had already moved one step ahead of him somewhere else, in a game he hadn't even known had begun. He had won the night before. He had lost something far greater, and he had lost it before he ever sat down at the table. Tobias continued, his voice becoming lower. He said there was one more matter, and this one would be even harder to hear. The opposing attorney had included a preliminary legal opinion arguing that all the audio in the recordings Raphael had collected could be excluded from the case. The reason was that in this state, recording another person's spoken words required the consent of every party present, and not everyone in that house had agreed to be recorded. Raphael asked about the images. Tobias said the video might remain, but without the sound, the gentle voice explaining that cold water was good for the joints, the remark about elderly people needing structure, and all the words that condemned the speaker by themselves could be removed. What would remain was only the image of an older woman sitting beside a basin of water, and the other side could easily argue that she had chosen to do it, that it was a form of physical therapy, and that nothing proved she had been forced. Raphael clenched his jaw. Then Tobias told him the most difficult thing of all. He said Raphael needed to understand something about guardianship cases. In this kind of proceeding, the court didn't view wealth as an advantage. On the contrary, the court was inclined to distrust the party with more money, because where there were substantial assets, there was motive. And in this case, the person with the great fortune, the trust fund, and an entire harbor empire wasn't Sienna. It was him. Tobias said plainly that the wealthier Raphael was, the greater his disadvantage would be, and that the other side would construct the image of a powerful man who had neglected his aging mother for years, then staged an elaborate performance when his wife sought a divorce so he could seize control. He said this might be the first time in Raphael's life that the thing he possessed in greatest abundance had turned against him. Raphael stood, walked to the window, and looked down at the stream of traffic moving along the street beneath the cold morning light. All his life, he had used money as a language, a weapon, and a wall. Now, for the first time, it had become an accusation against him. He asked Tobias how much time he had left. Tobias said the emergency hearing had been scheduled quickly, and he had only about 36 hours. Within those 36 hours, he had to find evidence that required no sound at all, evidence that could stand on its own without any voice being heard, evidence that no clever attorney could argue had been taken out of context. He ended the call, stood motionless beside the window for a while, then turned back toward the desk and called Hollis. While Raphael was still counting every remaining hour, on the south side of the city a stranger came looking for Delphine. He waited for her in the parking lot behind the building where she worked the night shift, dressed neatly and speaking with polished courtesy, and he didn't waste much time circling the point. He said he represented a party with an interest in the Stanton family matter, that they understood she was facing difficult circumstances, and that they would greatly appreciate it if she withdrew whatever she intended to say and kept her distance from the situation. Then he named a figure. It was enough to erase the entire stack of hospital bills she kept in a drawer and no longer opened, enough to spare her brother from choosing the cheapest dialysis session, enough to let her sleep through one night without calculating. Delphine stood there gripping the strap of her bag, and she could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no either. She said she needed time to think, and the man left her a phone number and arranged to meet her the following evening. She boarded the bus home, and halfway there she opened her phone and saw a message from August. He wrote that he had overheard the call that afternoon when she thought he was asleep. Then he continued, and Delphine read every word beneath the shifting lights of passing traffic outside the window. He wrote, "Sis, I've stayed alive this long because you kept lying to everyone and telling them I was fine." He wrote, "This time, don't lie anymore." He wrote, "I can handle it. I'm used to it." Delphine read the message 3 times, turned off the screen, then turned it back on, and read it once more. The following evening, she went to the meeting. She sat and listened until the man had said everything, nodding at the right moments and asking a few questions so he would keep talking. And inside her coat pocket, her phone was recording from the first word to the last. The next morning, she brought the recording to Raphael. She told him everything that had happened, placed the phone on the table, and pressed play. Raphael listened to the entire recording without interrupting, and for the first time since Delphine had known him, she saw his face become empty. Not angry, but empty. Like a room from which all the air had suddenly been drawn. He reached for his own phone, made a call, and spoke exactly 4 short sentences. He said the man's name. He said he needed to know where the man lived, what he drove, and whom he owed money to. He said no one was to go near him. Then he said he only needed the man to know that he knew. Raphael ended the call, and when he turned back to Delphine, his voice had returned to normal, gentle, as though the man from a moment earlier had been someone else. He asked whether she had eaten. Delphine looked at him for a long time, then asked a question she couldn't hold back. She asked how he lived with both of those men inside the same body, the man who had just made that call and the man who had just asked whether she had eaten. Raphael looked at her and said the first man kept the second one alive. That night, he went to a late-night restaurant on Archer Avenue, where Conrad Vale still ate dinner alone at a late hour. Vale looked up when he saw him and didn't appear surprised. Before Raphael had fully settled into his seat, Vale offered him a trade. Withdraw everything in exchange for the port contract Vale had lost years earlier. Raphael didn't answer immediately. He ordered a bowl of soup and ate every last spoonful in silence while Vale waited. Then he set down the spoon, wiped his mouth, and began speaking in the voice he used when discussing the weather. He mentioned an addendum Vale had once signed with a company owned by one of his relatives, without putting it through a bidding process. He mentioned a shipment Vale had declared missing, though it was still sitting untouched inside a warehouse in the suburbs. Raphael said he had kept those things for years without using them, and Vale knew why. Because until now, Vale had never touched anyone in Raphael's family. Raphael took out some money and placed enough on the table to cover both meals. Then he stood. He said, "Now you have touched them. Go home and sleep. You'll need to be clear-headed tomorrow." He walked out of the restaurant, leaving Vale seated there with an untouched bowl of soup before him. The courtroom was smaller than Raphael had imagined, with a low ceiling, white lights, and air that smelled of old paper. Sienna's attorney was a composed woman with a voice as smooth as velvet, and she didn't make the mistake Raphael had prepared himself to confront. She didn't attack Margaret. She didn't say a single word that would embarrass the older woman. Instead, she turned every sharp edge toward Raphael, and she aimed at exactly the right place. She asked how many nights he had been away from home during the past 3 years. Raphael gave her a number. She asked whether he had counted them. He said he had, but he had only begun counting the week before. She asked whether he knew which medications his mother was taking, what times she took them, and in what doses. Raphael was silent. The entire room waited. He opened his mouth, then said no. He didn't know. It was the only moment in this entire story when that man was completely defeated, and he didn't resist. He offered no excuses, didn't mention the flights, and didn't take credit for building the house. He simply sat there and accepted the truth that he hadn't known some of the simplest things about his own mother. When her turn came, Hollis presented no sound at all. She offered only silent things. The records of 3 requests to repair the water heater, all 3 marked cancelled under the same account name, the food delivery receipt for that enormous house, clearly showing only 2 meals. The conclusion from the Elder Protection Hotline, closed for lack of sufficient evidence, with the reporter's name written on the final line. The paper label on the refrigerator shelf. And finally, the call log from the large button phone. 7 entries, 7 timestamps, each call lasting only a few seconds. Not a single spoken word was played, but together, those things formed a picture no attorney could claim had been taken out of context. Then Margaret was called forward. She walked slowly, one hand resting on the back of a chair, and in her ears were the new hearing aids her son had just taken her to receive. She sat down with both hands in her lap, and they trembled as they always had. Sienna's attorney approached with a gentle voice and asked what seemed like an innocent question. She asked whether Margaret remembered the last time her son had sat down and eaten dinner with her. Margaret was silent for a while. Then she said she didn't remember. She said it was because he never came home. The room fell still, and for that moment everyone believed the older woman had unknowingly driven a nail into her own son. The attorney lifted her head slightly, thinking she had just won. But Margaret hadn't finished. She continued slowly, saying she remembered another night from a very long time ago, when the boy was still only a few years old, and came down with a high fever in the middle of the night. She said they had no money for a car, so she carried him on her back and walked to the clinic, crossing several blocks in the cold, while praying the entire way. Then she said she had sold her wedding ring to pay for his medicine. She said she hadn't dared tell him, so she told him she had lost the ring at the laundry factory. In the front row, Raphael sat completely still. He was hearing it for the first time in his life, in the middle of a courtroom. After all those years of believing a lie he had never once thought to question. Margaret turned toward him and said she didn't need him to come home every night. She said she only needed to be able to sit at the table in his house without asking anyone's permission. After a moment, the attorney asked her one final question, whether she truly wanted to live with her son, or whether she was only saying what he wanted to hear. Margaret reached into the pocket of her sweater, took out a piece of paper, folded into quarters, and handed it to the clerk. On it were 7 lines, 7 dates, written in trembling, slanting handwriting. She said those were the 7 times she had tried to call her son and couldn't reach him. She said she was hard of hearing, and her memory wasn't very good, so she wrote them down. Then she said she hadn't written them to blame him. She had written them because she was afraid she might forget that she still wanted to call. And in that room, silent as a grave, There were two women carrying the same fear within them. One already gone, and one still sitting there, both of them taking up a pen to record the things everyone else had forgotten, only because they feared that one day they too might be forgotten. The guardianship petition was dismissed that same afternoon. There was no need for lengthy deliberation. Once the folded piece of paper had been read aloud, once those 7 silent timestamps lay side by side on the table, every argument about therapeutic exercise and voluntary cooperation dissolved like mist. The following morning, Sienna left the house. There was no struggle, no sudden flood of tears. She stood in the foyer with 2 suitcases, her hair still perfectly arranged, her coat still smooth, while Tobias had all the papers prepared. Before leaving, she stopped in front of Raphael and spoke, not to beg, but as though she needed him to understand one final thing. She asked whether he knew what it felt like to grow up in a house where her mother was treated by the entire family like a debt. She told him that her family had once been comfortable, then went bankrupt when she was still a child. And afterward her mother became a shadow sitting in the corner, spoken about in the same tone people used for an unpaid bill. She said she had sworn to herself that she would never become that useless woman. Then she spoke her final sentence, and for the first time in the entire story, her voice sounded real. She said that whenever she looked at Margaret, she didn't see her mother-in-law. She saw herself 40 years from now. Raphael listened to everything. He felt neither anger nor pity. He only said that she had been so afraid of being treated like something disposable that she had rehearsed it by treating someone else that way first. He said she hadn't been protecting herself at all. She had been proving herself right. Then he added something he hadn't used in court, something he had saved for this moment alone. He told her that her mother was still alive in a care facility in Rockford, and that Sienna had paid the fees there faithfully for years, without visiting her even once. Sienna didn't answer. She looked at him for another moment, then took hold of her suitcases and turned away. The great door closed behind her very softly. So softly, it was almost impossible to hear. The weeks that followed weren't a miracle. Margaret didn't wake one morning and become the woman she had once been. She still asked permission before turning on the television in the living room. She still asked whether sitting in a certain chair would bother anyone. She still ate very little, and once Raphael caught her secretly leaving half her meal untouched because the habit of fearing there wouldn't be enough had settled too deeply inside her. He didn't pressure her. He did small things. He personally called a repairman to fix the water heater in the basement, and he stood there watching until hot water truly began to flow, placing his own hand beneath it to make certain. Then he took his mother for another hearing test. When the technician finished fitting the small hearing aids into her ears and asked her to try speaking with a family member, Raphael sat down in front of her and called softly, "Mother." Margaret heard him. She heard him clearly and completely, without having to read his lips, without piecing his words together from broken fragments of sound, and she began to cry in the middle of the clinic, covering her face with both hands, because it had been so very long since she had heard her son's voice as it truly was. Not long afterward, while clearing a corner of his mother's room, Raphael found an old sewing basket, and beneath its lining was an unstamped envelope, dated several months earlier. He opened it. Inside was a letter written in trembling handwriting. His mother wrote that she had meant to call him, but the phone never seemed to connect, so she had written instead, though she probably wouldn't send it because she didn't know the address of his office and felt too embarrassed to ask. She wrote that she didn't want to complain, that the house was beautiful. It truly was. Only the basement was a little cold, and she sometimes forgot to bring her socks. Then, at the end of the letter, she reminded him to eat breakfast, because when he was little, he often skipped it and ended up with a stomachache. Not one accusation. Not a single word about everything she had endured. There was only her worry that her son might be skipping breakfast. Raphael sat down right there on the floor with the letter in his hand, and for the first time in this entire story, the man whom no one in the city dared look directly in the eyes lowered his head and wept. Raphael wanted to send people down to demolish the laundry room in the basement. He wanted to erase it from the house, to erase every memory of the basin filled with cold water and the low plastic stool. But Margaret stopped him. She placed a hand on her son's arm and told him not to erase it. She said removing it would be the same as pretending it had never happened, and people shouldn't pretend that things that happened were never real. So they kept the room, but gave it a different purpose. The washing machine was moved upstairs, and the space became a small sewing room with a fabric cutting table, a warm lamp. shelves of colorful thread arranged in rows like pieces of candy, and an old radio playing music from years gone by. On the wall, Raphael rehung the wedding photograph of his parents. The one no one had known had been put away. A new member of the household also appeared in the corner of the room. An elderly gray cat named Button, whom Margaret adopted from a rescue shelter. She said hardly anyone wanted to adopt an old cat, but older cats knew how to sit quietly with someone for longer, and that was exactly what she needed. Then Raphael did something larger, something he had been carrying in his heart since the night he read his mother's unsent letter. He created a program and named it Warm Hands. The program focused on only two things. The first was training maintenance workers, building managers, and delivery workers to recognize the signs that an elderly person was being neglected inside their own home, because Raphael had come to understand that these were the only people who entered other people's houses every day. The people who might see what an entire system of documents failed to see. The second was a provision protecting home caregivers who dared to speak up, so they would never again lose their jobs for doing what was right. And that provision was named after Delphine. She agreed to become the training coordinator, though she hesitated at first because she had never completed her education. But Raphael told her that she had seen what an entire house filled with grown people had failed to see, and no diploma could teach that. Margaret agreed to let the program use her name, but only on one condition. She said the program mustn't rush to accuse people's families before listening to them. She said some children weren't cruel at all, they were simply exhausted, and people had to learn how to tell the difference between those two things, because treating them as the same would be unjust. Not long afterward, a letter arrived from Sienna, sent from the place where she was receiving therapy. One line in the letter said she had gone to Rockford and sat beside her own mother for 3 hours, even though the woman no longer recognized her. Margaret read the letter slowly, then placed it on the table. She said she forgave her. Then she said forgiveness didn't mean opening the door and allowing her to come back. Forgiveness meant she would no longer let Sienna rent space inside her mind. As for Conrad Vale, Raphael didn't use his old methods. He sent every record of Vale's misconduct to the Port Authority and the regulatory agencies, openly and in full compliance with every required procedure. When Tobias asked why he hadn't chosen the quicker path he had always preferred, Raphael said the old way was the reason his mother had once believed she needed to remain silent to keep him out of trouble, and he didn't want her to be afraid on his behalf ever again. Then he resigned from his position of control over the dockworkers' union, letting go of the power he had spent his entire life building. One afternoon, he asked Delphine whether she was free that Sunday. She asked what she was supposed to be free for. He said to do nothing at all. Then asked whether she had ever had an afternoon devoted entirely to doing nothing. Delphine opened her mouth to answer, then realized she couldn't, because she had never had an afternoon like that in her life. That afternoon, beside Lake Michigan, Margaret and Raphael sat together on a stone bench. Resting on her lap were the gray-blue gloves, now worn from being used every day. She told her son she wasn't proud of him because he was wealthy. She was proud because he had finally allowed himself to see. Raphael said he wished he had seen sooner. Margaret gently took his hand and said, "Son, no one reaches the end of a lifetime without overlooking something." She said what mattered was whether, when the truth came knocking, he opened the door or pretended he couldn't hear it. Then she smiled and said she truly was hard of hearing, but he had chosen to listen. Farther down the path beside the lake, Delphine was slowly pushing another elderly woman in a wheelchair, part of her new work with the program, and the sound of their laughter drifted back on the wind. This story leaves us with 3 simple but profound truths. Elderly people aren't worn-out belongings from the past. They are the foundation beneath the entire house. And when we remove that foundation, everything standing above it, no matter how magnificent, is only waiting for the day it begins to lean and fall. Neglect isn't always loud. Sometimes it is so quiet that all it leaves behind is a small label attached to a refrigerator shelf. And those who dare to speak for the vulnerable are often the very people with the least to lose, which is why they are the ones we must protect first. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so that every day we can listen to more meaningful stories together. How do you feel about this story? About Raphael, about Margaret, and about the young woman named Delphine? Please leave a comment and share what you feel from the depths of your heart, because we truly want to listen to you. Thank you for staying with us until the very last words. We wish you, the person watching this video, abundant health, a joyful life, peace in every day, and the grace to see the people who love you before it is too late. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.